Hi, we're going to be reviewing period 3 here for your test on Wednesday. So don't forget the test is 55 multiple choice questions. 39 of those questions are just straight multiple choice. The other 16 are reflected like they will be on your AP test in May, where you're basing your questions are based on a primary source, a very short excerpt or a political cartoon. So a good place to go if you want to do some practicing. I'm using your ebook here, but this is in your textbook also. So if you're on your online book, you go to the ebook here on the left-hand side, and then you go down, you scroll down to where it says period 3 review. You can click on period 3 review. That takes you to what is in your textbook page 252, and it goes over key concepts and events. So if you click on Albany Plan of Union, it takes you straight to the book where it was, so you can read around the text if you need to. Or you can, again, you can go down the list here, all these names that should be familiar to you. And if they aren't, you can read up on them. The key people here from the text. Now, I'm not testing you on, okay, such and such, what's the answer to name? But the names go along with the events that you're learning about. So that should be, these should jog your memory. I'm not expecting you to remember all of these names. That would be impossible. But the big names from what we learned about, Jefferson and Hamilton and Washington, and the events surrounding the American Revolution, the Stamp Act and the Boston Massacre and things of that nature. Like if you can fit these in with the time period that we're learning about, you are in great shape. Keep in mind the whole test is multiple choice, so the answer is somewhere on the page. The chronology here is also on page 252. Actually, I'm sorry, the people are on page 251. The chronology that takes you through the timeline, all in your textbook. When you're done with that, looking through that, if you want to take an AP practice exam, you click on it here. It's on page 253A in your book. What I'll do is I'll post the answers. There's 15 multiple choice questions, each based off of, like this one's based off of a graph, the questions. The next one is based off of a political cartoon. The next is based off of a short excerpt. This would be really good practice for you if you're trying to study for your test tomorrow, just to kind of get you in the mindset of what you'll have to do for the last 16 questions. These are not hard per se, but you do have to read the primary source, and you have to read it carefully and think about what you're reading. And again, I'll post the answers for you. So for those of you that want to get a little head start on it, you'll at least know if you're correct or not. Don't worry about when you see short answer questions, and then there's document-based questions. You don't have to worry about those. We will be getting to those later in the class. So let's go to do a little review here. This is the PowerPoint that I gave you the first day that we did this course, or the first day that we opened up period 3. It's also on your Google Classroom page. That's where I'm getting everything here. All right, so the beginning. The first section is called International Conflicts Cause Colonial Tensions. And again, I'm not going to go over this slide by slide and go over everything, because by this point, you're probably pretty familiar with a lot of this, but I want to go over some of the bigger details or the big picture stuff. The 7 Years' War is what begins period 3. So 1754 to 1800 is period 3. 1754 being the French and Indian War, 1800 being the election of 1800, where Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, beats John Adams, the Federalist. So we've gone a long way in a 46-year period. 1754, French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War in Europe begins. Remember, George Washington inadvertently begins this war. He's the Virginia colonel who goes into western Pennsylvania to ask the French to kindly leave their forts, Presque Isle and LaBeouf and Duquesne, and a war breaks out from some misunderstandings that happen there. Washington himself, again, is not the best commander in the war by any means. He plays a minor role in it. But as the war goes on, this becomes another King William's War, King George's War, Queen Anne's War. But in this case here, it's going to have a more lasting effect. That the French and the British had fought wars before, but this one's going to have a lasting effect because in the end, the French end up losing all of their North American claims. All right, the Albany Plan of Union. Remember Benjamin Franklin, the snake, and Benjamin Franklin's failed plan to unify the colonies, which is a precursor to what's coming during the American Revolution. The Join or Die. Remember this from Franklin. The map of the 7 Years' War. Again, when it's all said and done, France. This is what they had before. They have all of what is now Louisiana Territory, or what was Louisiana Territory, all the way up into Canada. They lose everything. The Spanish actually gain Louisiana, but the British territory now expands from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Mississippi River. If you remember, the colonists believed that this land is land that they are entitled to. But because of Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, the British are trying to cut their losses. They are in significant debt. They cannot afford another war. So they passed the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbids colonists moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. This is, in some historians' minds, the straw that broke the camel's back, the moment where the colonists realize that they will never be seen as equal by the British. And this is when you start to see some forms of rebellion brewing in the colonies. All right, so the Proclamation Line is illustrated here, this red line. Colonists could not move west of that line. You can see all the forts in the west. Do you have to memorize names of all these forts? Absolutely not. Don't worry about it. But the gist of the first section is the French-Indian War gets the French out of North America. It changes the relationship permanently between the colonists and the British. Second module is resistance to Britain intensifies. We talk about sovereignty, independence. The American colonists are increasingly seeing themselves as independent of Great Britain. They don't want to break away per se, but they do want to be treated with more dignity, more respect, to be given more freedom. I used the example of a parent-child relationship. The Great Britain is the mother colony. Remember, this is mercantilism. More needs to flow into the mother country than flows out. And we, the 13 colonies, are like the children who are growing up. We want more independence, and Mother Britain is trying to lay the hammer down. Parliament's pushing royal authority, and the colonists are resisting. Taxation without representation. Remember, the British themselves are in significant debt, so they're going to start to pass taxes on the colonists to try to pay for the French and Indian War. They're going to also eliminate salutary neglect. Remember, that was the British are overlooking all the little things that the Americans are doing that are breaking the rules. But after 1763, they're going to start to crack down on the smuggling. They're going to start to crack down on illegally trading with foreign countries and domestic manufacturing, because they need those taxes to pay for the war debt. They passed the Sugar Act. They passed the Currency Act. Eventually, they're going to pass the Stamp Act here, which was the big one. That was a direct tax over the heads of the local legislatures in the colonies. So the Parliament in London is taxing the colonists directly without their consent. We developed committees of correspondence. If you remember, that was Massachusetts writing letters down to Connecticut and Rhode Island, and all the way down New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and it circulates to the colonies. And what they're realizing is that they have in common the fact that they feel like they're being treated poorly, and that Britain is becoming more tyrannical. Britain responds by saying, listen, you don't need to have people in Parliament because we virtually represent you. Your interests are our interests, and we're doing what's best for you. And that didn't fly with the colonies, obviously. The Stamp Act fails. The British passed the Declaratory Act, basically rescinding the Stamp Act, but declaring that they can pass any law against the colonists that they see fit. So although you've won this round, we are still in charge of you, and we will crack down on you if we have to. A year later, they passed the Townshend Acts. This is, they think of the Stamp Act Part 2. For the class, or for the test, you don't have to worry about what they're taxing per se, but know that they are directly taxing the colonists over the heads of the local legislatures. 1770, you got the Boston Massacre. Because tensions are brewing, the British are here. They're forced to be quartered in Boston at colonial expense. They're not getting paid very well. This is another time of economic depression. They're competing with colonists for jobs. One thing leads to another. Long story short, the Boston Massacre happens. 5 American colonists lay dead, Crispus Attucks being one of them. In 1773, the British East India Company is in debt. They're facing bankruptcy. They're given a monopoly on the tea trade in the colonies. The Americans do not like this. They don't like the fact that their choice is being taken away, their freedom of choice. The Boston Tea Party, and as a result of that, the British passed the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts, or what we would call the Intolerable Acts. But this is when the First Continental Congress is formed in response to the Intolerable Acts, which were in response to the Boston Tea Party, which was in response to the Tea Act. You see how there's a chain of events here. So the First Continental Congress got together in 1774, not to break away from Great Britain. They got together to discuss, where do we go from here? They end up boycotting British goods. They raise a continental army just in case. But they're trying to make peace with Great Britain. It's not until the Second Continental Congress that America declares independence. So Module 3, it's called The American Revolution Begins. So the first shots of the war are fired at Lexington in April of 1775. You have the patriots on one side, people who are gung-ho for independence, and you have the British loyalists on the other, people in the colonies who are still loyal to the crown, they're loyal to Great Britain. The Continental Congress forms the Continental Army. Like I said, George Washington is the commander-in-chief. You've got the Minutemen in Massachusetts. These are militiamen who are to be ready at a minute's notice to fight the British if necessary. In May of 1775, in response to the shots at Lexington, the Second Continental Congress meets. And in June of 1775, Richard Henry Lee says that we should declare independence from Great Britain. And by July 4th, 1776, Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence. It's approved and shown to the Americans now on July 4th. That's why it's considered to be our date of independence. This is when it becomes public. Dunmore's proclamation, if you can remember, really brought a lot of the southern plantation owners into the side of the Americans, because this declared that any slave that fights for the British against the Americans would be granted their freedom. And this freaks out a lot of southern plantation owners because their ultimate fear is slave rebellion, and here are the British stoking the fires. Declaration of Independence we discussed already. We talked about loyalists. We talked about patriots. The turning point of the war, if you remember, was the Battle of Saratoga, because early on in the war, America is having some small victories, but early on the British have the advantage. They take Boston, they take New York City, they effectively cut the colonies in half. The Americans are looking for European allies. They are trying to get France on their side. Benjamin Franklin is the envoy to France. John Adams joins him as his number two. The Battle of Saratoga proves to the French that the American cause is a cause worth joining, that we can fight and do some damage on our own. So Saratoga is considered to be the turning point, because that shows the French what we're made of, and it shows the French that we are worth joining. So the French are going to join us, and the tide of the war is going to change because of that. We talked about the Continental Army not being the best soldiers, George Washington not being the best general, but he was an effective leader of men. The Continental Army was a small ragtag bunch, but they, were mostly from the poorer classes, farmers who were hoping to get some land after the war, and that is what a majority of them were paid in, was land, because the Continental currency became worthless during the war because of inflation. Remember, the Articles of Confederation are what the Continental Congress is operating under. The Articles of Confederation say that the national government cannot tax its citizens. The state governments have to. So they're relying on states for money to fight the war. States are not necessarily all ponying up the way that they should. Congress is printing money and it's becoming worthless. All right. British are eventually going to declare war on France. Spain's going to declare war on Great Britain. It's a European-wide conflict, not necessarily taking place in Europe like previous wars had. But European allies see a chance here to get back at the British for past defeats, such as the French-Indian War for the French. I'm not going to make you memorize all the battles of the war, or all you need to really understand what the battles is. It begins at Lexington. Saratoga is the turning point, and the final battle of the war is at Yorktown, where General Cornwallis is cornered by the French Navy and by George Washington's forces. That was in 1781. It's a 2-year peace negotiation. In 1783, John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams signed the Treaty of Paris, which officially ends the war. So it's wonderful as far as the Americans go. America's independent. They're free of the British. However, this is when growing pains really start to take effect, because now that we're our own country, Great Britain is no longer trading with us. That was our greatest trading partner. We're going to have to try to become a major player on our own, and our struggles are great at the beginning because of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So Section 5 is governing in revolutionary times. Every state is creating its own constitution at this time. Some are abolishing slavery. Some are putting their states on the path to abolish slavery. Others are strengthening the institutions of slavery, giving religious freedom to its people. What they all have in common, every state constitution, is they're putting the power in the state and away from the federal government. They're trying to give individual citizens the most freedom that they possibly can, because their big fear after the revolution is that you have a tyranny that replaces the British tyranny. We fought the British to get rid of a monarch. We're trying to make sure that the people after the war are as free as possible. What we're going to see here with things like Shays' Rebellion, that a lot of what the state governments are passing acts that are difficult for the colonists to pay taxes on, it's going to lead to more issues. So the Articles of Confederation says that the federal government cannot tax its citizens. It says that there's only one branch of government, and that's a legislative branch. It takes 9 out of 13 states to get any major legislation passed. It's creating a weak federal government on purpose, but it becomes so weak that it is having trouble taking care of itself. It relies too much on the states to help it in times of trouble. In the 1780s, states like Massachusetts passed a law saying that taxes must be paid in gold and silver. Farmers themselves do not have gold and silver. They have paper currency. Their land is their wealth. When they can't pay, a lot of their land is taken from them. So you have events like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786 that reinforce just how weak the federal government is, and that's going to lead to the Constitutional Convention. Going back, though, I'm going a little bit ahead of myself. We have these lands here in the West. This Western land is what state governments, federal governments, and individuals saw as the salvation of the United States. The future of the United States lay west. They could sell Western lands to make money. They could move west to make a livelihood for themselves. So you have the Treaty of Fort Stanwix are trying to establish better relationships with the Native Americans. The Northwest Ordinance sets up rules for moving westward. And we're going to have to end this particular, we're going to have to end right now for part 1. Part 2 will be next.